country. Is there a consensus within the EU as to what they should do in order to make changes within those countries? So what kinds of sanctions to place, how great the sanctions should be?
Great question. Now let's get you. Are you for regime change in the world? Is that part of European consensus? And where are you changing the regimes? I mean, you have changed your regime in Spain. Where else do you want to change regimes? And should I be scared of you because tomorrow you may want to change regime in Pakistan? And secondly, I would like to link this question, which is a great question once again from West Michigan. I'd like to link it to the problem of Iran, where there are differences, or so it appears, between an American position and a European position. What is the truth about European positions on regime change, on sanctions, on Iran, etc., all of which are fundamental pillars of US foreign policy?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a very complicated question. Very good question, by the way, but very complicated. I will try to answer it in the most, I would say, open possible manner, but also being as concise as possible. The European Union, of course, is a democratic power and wants to see democracy develop and expand through the world. So what we would like to see is progressively more democratic countries around the world. And before we get to that, more countries or less countries that violate human rights and that do not respect some fundamental aspects of human dignity. That's one thing. Another thing is how we go about it. And clearly, in that sense, the European Union does not favor a, so to say, violent way of achieving this objective. On the contrary, we think that it should be achieved through partnership and cooperation. And that's the essence of most of the regimes that we have established with different groups of countries around the world. We have a specific partnership with all the Mediterranean countries, on the south side of the Mediterranean. We have a special regime with countries of Africa, Caribbean and Pacific under the Cotonou agreements. We have other specific arrangements that deal with cooperation, development, but deal also with those aspects of democratization, of progressive freedom, etc. And in those regimes, in some of them, we have our own system to look at possible sanctions when there is a situation of gross violation of the principles that we have agreed. But those are enshrined in the treaties that we have signed. For instance, within the Cotonou agreement that links Europe to almost 100 countries, as I said before, in Africa, the Caribbean, Pacific, there are several articles that are applied when a situation like this arises. And those articles foresee first the initiation of conversations, of negotiations to see, to examine the situation, to try to agree on the prognosis and also to agree on how things should be done. And of course, if these things do not progress, there is a point in which there is an article that allows for sanctions to be implemented. So that's one way, is the way of our partnership agreements and what is in those agreements that allows us to cope with certain situations in a manner which is based first and foremost on negotiation, but can also include sanctions. The other, of course, way is when we are applying sanctions that are taken by the UN. When the Security Council takes a decision to apply sanctions to a specific country, the EU automatically applies that decision of the Security Council and makes it its own decision to apply these sanctions. And of course, there are some other cases in which the EU has applied its autonomous sanctions. But sanctions in that respect are not aimed to a regime change, are aimed to changing a specific situation, which is quite different. And of course, the specific situation after that can evolve into something else. But basically, the sanctions regime is to put an end to a specific situation of violation.
Over to Lockhaven for a question from there.
Good morning. My name is Carissa Fonestock. I'm a sophomore at Lockhaven. My question is, considering countries that are European but do not wish to be a part of or do not gain acceptance into the EU, such as Switzerland, what is to happen to these countries financially? Essentially, would these countries almost feel forced to comply and join the EU or otherwise be economically and financially inept?
Switzerland.
Well, that's not the case with Switzerland, certainly. They are a very powerful economy. And of course, they are not members of the EU because they didn't want to be members of the EU, which is a different approach. It's not that the EU has not accepted them, but that they do not think that at this time it is interesting for them to join the EU. There are basically 3 countries in Europe that do not find it interesting at this moment to join the EU. This is Switzerland, this is Norway, and this is Iceland. 3 of them very developed, very extremely, in some cases, extremely rich countries that probably think that it would have more inconvenience for them joining the EU than not doing so. Nevertheless, 2 of them, Iceland and Norway, are linked to the EU through a system which is called the European Economic Space. In the case of Switzerland, they didn't want to even join that economic space, so we have a strictly bilateral relation. But we have a tremendous network of agreements signed and that have been negotiated and signed with Switzerland. So in many, many, many respects, Switzerland is almost as much part of the single market of the EU as if it was a member. There are only very specific differences here and there that make them a part of the single market. And that's also concerning many of the obligations that the single market implies. The Swiss government has and Parliament have also accepted that. There is one thing, though, that you have mentioned in which I think you are right. For the weight of the EU in Europe is such that for any European country not wanting to join the EU, it implies nevertheless to accept almost automatically many of the decisions that the EU takes. It's a de facto situation. If the EU, for instance, approves a regulation concerning how a certain electrical appliance should be built, if you are in Europe and your trade is in 70% taking place with the European Union, you better apply that regulation because you want to sell your product in the European Union. So in fact, even those countries that have not joined the EU in many respects are bound by de facto need of complying with EU regulations and norms. But that's, of course, their choice.
Final question from Teaneck. Madison can relay.
Yes, hi. This is from Muhammad Ali. Does the rest of the world feel threatened by the, quote, monster called the European Union?
Are you a union or a monster?
A monster.
That's the problem.
Well, we hope not to be a monster. No, I think there was much talk a few years ago about the Fortress Europe and things like that tend to somehow portray an image of Europe only inward-looking and trying to keep a part of the rest of the world. Well, that's a completely false image. It happens that with all the problems that we recognize we have and we have to tackle in dealing with the rest of the world, for instance, issues that will be negotiated in Hong Kong soon under the trade Doha round negotiations concerning export subsidies to agricultural products or other sorts of subsidies, etc., a number of different issues that sometimes make it easy to portray the EU as a kind of egoist, as I said before, inward-looking power that does not care too much of what happens around the world. Well, that's absolutely falls, the EU is the most open market in the world. We are the main importers, the #1 importers, well ahead the US and